Hey Bible study teachers, welcome back to our YouTube lessons. I do thank you for your patience on waiting for one of these again. It's been a while. I do apologize, I've had technical issues with cameras not working, but my iPhone seems to work just fine, so I'm going to use it from now on. But let's get right to it, shall we? For I have a lot to say and not a whole lot of time to say it in. We're in lesson 31. We're looking at the third of a three-part series of lessons on David. This lesson can be found in 2 Samuel chapter 11 and 12. And this is the famous story of David and Bathsheba. Let me give you a quick overview of the story. And let me just kind of point out the obvious. This is wonderful how this lesson on sin, on temptation, on the consequence of sin would fall on Easter Sunday. It's very fitting for that to happen. God in His foreknowledge just planned this, and His sovereign divine foreknowledge just beautifully crafted this, that you get the opportunity to share the gospel, ultimately lead the guests. You should have maybe more guests than you usually have. Lead them to the ultimate reality. Sin is existent, sin happens, what do you do with sin? And then you point them to the cross. So wonderful, wonderful lesson. But basically the story goes this way. David, who's the king of Israel, who's a wonderful man, the Bible speaks of him as a man after God's own heart. And David is just lounging around. The Bible says he gets up from his couch, he's just walking around on the rooftops of his house. He looks over and sees a beautiful woman bathing. She's cleaning herself, she's naked of course, and he lusts after her. He sends word, who is that woman? They tell her that's Bathsheba. His servants tell her that's Bathsheba, Uriah the Hittite's wife. Well, then he summons her and sleeps with her. And he sends her away. And then she sends a message to him saying, David, I'm pregnant with your child. Now you're probably asking, where's Uriah? Uriah was in battle with the rest of Israel, with Joab, the general of the army, and where David should have been. Verse 1 of chapter 11 tells us that this is the time the kings go out to battle. David and the Israelites have been fighting the Ammonites. They're still fighting the Ammonites, and David should have been up there with him. The Ark of the Covenant is out there with the armies as well. So David, first of all, he's not even where he's supposed to be, which leads to this continual, perpetual, just a series of sins. Well, if that's not bad enough, he abuses his power as a king and arguably forcibly rapes this poor woman, gets her pregnant. If that's not bad enough, David proceeds to try and cover it up. He summons Uriah the Hittite, Bathsheba's husband, sends Joab, the general, a note, and tells him, why don't you send Uriah back home? I want to talk to him, kind of. And once Uriah's home, he devises a series of plans, gets him drunk, basically wants him to sleep with his wife. Why? Well, common sense. If he sleeps with his wife and then his wife gives birth to this child, he can say, aha, look, that's just part of husband and wife activity. Well, Uriah wants nothing of it. Uriah has consecrated himself to war. He tells David, listen, I can't go home and enjoy being home, being with my wife when my comrades are out in battle, when the Ark of the Covenant is out in battle, when I've consecrated myself to war. I can't do that. An honorable man, Uriah. Not so much David. So David continues to try and cover this up, gives Uriah a note and says, you go back to war and you give this note to Joab, the general. In the note, unbeknownst to Uriah, is Uriah's fate. David instructs Joab to ambush or to come up to fight. To bring his armies up to fight, and in the process he commands them, listen Joab, when things start getting rough, when the battle starts heating up, pull back and leave Uriah up in the front lines so he gets murdered, and then send word back to me. Well, that's what happens. Joab rushes his armies in, they start fighting, and when things get heated, Joab returns, Joab tells his armies to retreat, leaving Uriah up front, and he's killed. Along with Uriah, we're told, many of David's servants are killed. So David's sin started from, first of all, being lazy, just not doing what he's supposed to be doing, and just perpetually, just one after another, after another, after another. A more horrible sin after a more horrible sin. Well, God sends David a messenger, the man Nathan, to speak to about this sin. And Nathan shares with him this parable and says, hey David, come listen to this story. He says, suppose that there are two men. One of them is extremely wealthy. He has all these animals. He has just cows and lambs and cattle and all this stuff. And there's another man who has one little baby ewe lamb. And he loves this lamb. This lamb, the Bible says that it eats off of his lap and just drinks out of it. A pet. The Bible says that the guy treated this lamb like a daughter, like a family member. For those of you who have pets, who have dogs, I have a dog and we love our little Bella. You relate to this. This was a man's pet. And Nathan goes on and says, somebody came to visit the rich man. And the rich man didn't want to serve, to treat this man to any one of his animals. So he went over and stole this other man's one lamb, killed it, and offered it, as a meal to this man. And David is enraged, and Nathan asks David, what do you think the consequences for this man should be? And David says, he's just irate and says this man should be killed. He should repay this man fourfold for what he's done. And then Nathan turns things around him and says, that man is you, David. So what happens next? Well, David seeks forgiveness from God. He acknowledges his sin, and God forgives him. However, and here's an important general lesson for this lesson, sin, even forgiven sin, has consequences. Let me say that again. Sin, even forgiven sin, has consequences. So the three main tenets that you need to really address this Sunday, the first one is temptation. The fact that temptation is everywhere. It's interesting, the Apostle Paul, in writing to Corinth, he tells them, flee from sexual immorality. He tells them, flee from idolatry. He tells Timothy, flee from youthful passions. Run away from temptation. Run away. Turn the other way and run. And that's not what we see with David. If you look at, and by the way, this next statement is not an overstatement, but the entire account of 2 Samuel 11 and 12 hinge on verse 1. What happens in verse 1? The Bible tells us that David is home when kings go out to war. If David would have been at war, if David would have been doing what he needed to be doing, leading his men in victory, leading the Ark of the Covenant with them, and not home, the Bible says he gets up from the couch. The guy's just lounging around doing nothing. That leads him through this perpetual series of sins, one darker and darker than the other. So temptation, don't ever think that a temptation is too small. Don't ever think you can truly resist them without the help of God. Temptations are ever present, and you must be aware, you must always be alert. And like the Lord's Prayer, Jesus himself prayed, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. This idea that temptation, when it gets a hold of us, if left to our own strength, will succumb to it. And that's just the reality of it. Temptation leads us into sin. Sin is bad. Sin is horrible. We know that. But what we don't know is ultimately what the consequences of sin are. Look at what happens to David's life. That one sin led to the murder of poor Uriah in battle. Lust first led to arguably the rape of Bathsheba. Rape, you say? Do you think he raped her? Look, the king summons this poor woman into his court. Okay, he abuses his power by doing that. She can't deny him. I would argue that's rape. So he forces himself on this woman, gets her pregnant. The child, later we learn, dies. Lies and just does all this kind of backdoor, just lying and elaborate lies all over the place. Winds up getting Uriah killed. Winds up getting multiple of his servants killed in battle. And just lying after lying. The consequences we read later on in 2 Samuel, his son, one of David's half-sons, Amnon, rapes his half-sister Tamar. Absalom is murdered by Amnon. He is persecuted by his sons later. It's just this horrendous mess caused by this event here. This event leads to ultimate consequences. So keep that in mind. Sins have consequences. Even forgiven sins, there are still consequences. But the most beautiful part of this story is what you have in Psalm 51. Temptation, the consequence of sin, but then the confession of sin and ultimate restoration. Psalm 51 is a psalm written by David after this very account. David confesses his sin, and God forgives him. And ultimately, that's where you need to point your class to. That's where you need to point your visitors, your guests. That sin, however present, if confessed, will be forgiven. So, I hope this helps you this week. I pray that God would help you prepare your heart and mind to lead your people in the teaching of His Word.